So it's time to take a look at the full updated mission packs and rules. Let's talk through the changes that the latest chapter approved brings to Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're going to be digging into the non-points cost side of chapter approved, talking about all the changes that they've made to the game. Most of this stuff they've already previewed to some extent for us, but now we've got the full picture. It's really good to put everything in perspective and see which armies are coming out better or worse after these changes. In this video I thought we'd do a bit of an overview of what has changed, go through each section in specific, and then finish up with how I think it's going to affect army construction and what people choose going forward. So first up, to be clear about the changes in chapter approved, they are for the Grand Tournament mission pack, so you don't necessarily have to get too stressed about them for other modes of 40k. If you're not planning on using the missions on this book, you don't really technically have to pay any attention to these. Though just in general, I do see quite a lot of people who do try and build armies that could be tournament legal if they wanted to choose to run them there. For me, I do quite like playing with all the newest chapter approved rules, as it just feels to me more like the current version of 40k and what Games Workshop's got intended for the most up-to-date rules. The book's far more wide-reaching in changes than the previous edition of chapter approved. There's 4 major areas of change: fortifications, army constructions, the missions and the secondary objectives. Fortifications are slightly easier to deploy. You can't mix subfactions within an army anymore, which I'd say is probably the biggest change of the entire book. Quite a lot of people did use mixed subfaction armies for one reason or another, either for fluff or narrative reasons, or to make interesting and strong combos of rules. I did mention a rumour in the previous week that they might be decreasing the number of slots available in patrol detachments. That one doesn't seem to have appeared in this book. It could just be completely made up, or something that we might see in a future update or balanced data slate. Missions wise, the previous update didn't really rewrite them at all. This one, all the missions are new. There's 9 strike force and 9 incursion ones like there were previously. And the big changes here are that each mission seems to have a small twist, often around scoring objectives or getting free command points. And they also have a bonus primary objective and only 12 victory points per turn available for the standard objectives on the board. Finally, there's rather a lot of changes to secondary objectives. As seen previously, 7 of them have been tweaked in some way. They've updated the rules for picking them, saying that you have to pick at least 2 of them from this mission pack. That stops Space Marine chapters from picking 1 from their codex supplement and 1 from their main codex. They've updated the time when you actually need to pick secondaries. You now need to pick them after choosing your deployment zones, which to be honest I'm not sure really makes the biggest difference in the world in my opinion. And they've also got 6 new faction specific secondaries for a bunch of armies that didn't have any before. Again, we've already seen them in White Dwarf, but I'll cover them in brief in this video as well. In any case, let's go through each of these areas in brief, and then sum up by talking through how it might affect people's armies in general. First up, I do think that this fortification change is a good one. There's a rule stating that you can't set fortifications up more than 3 inches away from any bits of terrain besides hills. That was previously very restrictive, and they've basically added a rule to ensure that fortifications can deploy, saying if there's literally nowhere that you can set them up, you can swap out 1 terrain piece and put the fortification down there instead. Which would mean at the very least that there's no chance of paying the points for a fortification and then technically not being able to set it up on certain maps, though I feel like you still might struggle with things that are truly massive like a Fortress of Redemption. I guess that's quite a nice one to stop the worst case scenario, but you still might have trouble with fortifications and setup. If you still can deploy the fortification, you might have very little choice as to where. Say for example, you still might be relegated to somewhere irrelevant in the corner of the board if you can deploy it. A small boost there though. If you know which map you're going to be playing on, then this could genuinely be useful. If you know that this rule is going to take effect, then you could have some fairly decent choice of where you put down your fortification. The next rule is that one where you can have no more mixed subfactions within one army. For example, you now can't run Iron Hands alongside White Scars in one allied list. The same for say Armageddon Steel Legion or Vostrones for the Imperial Guard. I will stress that this is still just for this tournament mission pack, it isn't for 40k in general, but still that does just outright kill quite a lot of armies that people have built up already, if you did want to use them in competitive play. Basically each keyword that you can choose is now selected on an entire army basis, and not just for each unit or each detachment. It means that you'd only be able to have 1 chapter within the force, but it's still okay for things like Drakari, Cult, Covens and Cabals, as their keywords are all different. They have a couple of specific exceptions. Marks of Chaos and Demons allegiances aren't affected, nor are Free Blades or Dread Blades. This really does put some brakes on a lot of the more competitive combos in a lot of armies though. Maybe mixing guard regiments was usually quite a good idea. You can't have multiple Brotherhoods for Grey Knights anymore, and that means that you can't take more than 1 Grandmaster and Nemesis Dread Knight anymore. You can't put all of your Sisters of Battle in a Bloody Rose detachment if they're melee focused, and use a different one for range, and you can't have two orc clans fighting alongside each other, maybe one for melee and one for range again. I'm a little bit mixed as to whether or not I think this is a good change or not. It does make armies feel a little bit more coherent, and means you're no longer incentivized to split sub-factions if it makes more sense for your army. It also means each sub-faction really has to play to their strengths and weaknesses. However, I do think that it makes army construction a lot less interesting. I think that quite a lot of armies will just default to one sub-faction now being the competitive one to their force. Army choices might be a bit less diverse as a result, and it does kill some perfectly fluffy combos, things like Imperial Guard regiments working together, or multiple orc clans trying to outdo each other on the battlefield. For me, I feel that this is maybe a little bit heavy-handed. Maybe you could have charged a few command points if you do want to have multiple sub-factions. That could be a way of disincentivizing it, while still allowing it to be technically possible. I must admit, I'm not the biggest fan myself. It just kind of depends on how you like to play 40k. I think a lot of people will also really love the change. Next up, we come to the new missions. The major change being that you're going to be scoring 4, 8 or 12 for primary objectives, depending on how many you hold, and then the shortfall on points that you can't score from that anymore are made up from a bonus primary objective that sort of feels a little bit like an extra force secondary that your army has to prioritise along with all the rest that it's trying to do. It will mean a bit more bookkeeping and even more divided priorities for your army, but I think it does make each individual mission feel a bit more meaningful and different. While I do really quite like the current 9th edition missions, one criticism certainly is that they all feel a little bit similar, largely just fighting to take and hold points every single time, and then just do the secondaries that your army is going to be best at. In any case, let's very briefly glance over each one. The first one being Recover the Relics, 6 objectives, and the twist is that you only get your free command point if you control an objective in no man's land, and get a bonus one if you control one in the enemy deployment zone. The bonus objective is kind of a kill points one. You get up to 3 victory points per battle round, 1 for each enemy unit killed, so it is going to put armies with a small amount of units on the board at a bit of an advantage. Tear Down Their Icons has 5 objectives and a kind of diagonal deployment. It doesn't really have a twist, but I must admit the bonus objective does have quite a lot going on. Your units have to try and plant bombs in the enemy's territory. They can do that for an action that completes in their command phase. If you have objectives secured, then it means that you can plant them with an action that finishes in your turn, so your opponent doesn't have the chance to kill them. Those bombs create a little objective that your opponent can try and go for. They can try and defuse them with their own action. That one completes at the end of their turn, and on a 4+ the bomb is defused, or automatically if they have OBSEC. Finally, for the number of bombs in your opponent's territory at the end of the game, you get 4 victory points for each. It seems like quite a fun one, and one that will reward people who have really quite a lot of small action units, but it does mean that you might be a bit stretched if you want to be doing other actions as well. Next, Data Scry Salvage has 6 objectives. The twist means that if you control an objective in no man's land with an OBSEC unit, it remains in your control even if you move off it. And the bonus objective is to repeatedly do an action on your own deployment zone objective, and you score points at the end of the turn for the number of no man's land objectives currently held. So say if you did the action and then at the end of your turn you held 2 of the no man's land objectives, you'd score 2 VP. Quite a fun one, going to be a massive fight for those central points. Next up, we come to Abandoned Sanctuaries. This one's 5 objectives and Dawn of War deployments. The twist is maybe one of the most out there ones with no forward deployment units or pre-game moves, so it does mean that if you invested any points into those, then for this one those points aren't going to be quite as well rewarded. The bonus objective is all about fighting for the central objective. You get 2 victory points if you either take the midfield objective at the end of the turn, or you kill an enemy unit within 6 inches of it, and then the person who holds the central objective at the end of the game also gets another 5 victory points. Again, going to be nice for an army that's got something really tough to put in that centre. Next up, Conversion has 5 objectives and corner deployments. The twist is that you only get your command point if the warlord's on the battlefield, so it really incentivises hunting down the enemy one. And the bonus objective kind of doubles down on holding the points. You either get 4 victory points for holding your opponent's home objective, 2 victory points for holding any objective in no man's land, or -1 victory point if you don't control your home objective. They do stipulate though that you can't drop below 0 CP if things are going horribly badly. The Scouring doesn't appear to have a major twist, but their bonus objective is that one unit can do an all-spec scan action each turn. It's a defend style one, so it completes at the end of your next command phase. Your opponent does get the chance to kill your unit doing it, and at the end of the game you get 3 victory points per objective that you've scanned. I feel like maybe they've not tried to make an overcomplicated twist on the ones where you're doing more actions than normal. I feel like the Scouring might well be a good one for melee armies as well, with all of those objectives being quite so close together. Next up we have Tide of Conviction. This one's a Dawn of War style one with 6 objectives. though the ones in the middle do look like they might be a bit of a pain to measure out. The twist is that you only get your Battleforge command point if you hold your own home objective each turn, so you really want to do that and try and take the opponent's one away from them. And the bonus points are for taking objectives in the opponent's half. You get 2 victory points for the first 4 turns if you manage to take at least 1 objective in their half of the board, and then at the end of the game up to 8, 2 victory points for the no man's land ones and 4 for the home one. Death and Zeal is a corner deployment one with 5 objectives. The twist is similar to that Data Scry one, where if you control an objective with an OBSEC unit in your command phase, it remains in your control, even if your unit happens to move off it until your opponent takes it. The bonus in this one is basically for taking enemies off their objectives, 2 victory points either if you manage to take an objective that your opponent held at the start of the turn, or killed an enemy unit that was on an objective, or you get 3 victory points if you manage to do both. I guess ideally what you want to be doing is countercharging an enemy unit to death that was taking an objective. Finally, the last one is called Secure Missing Artifacts. Sorry, not the Scouring again, as I've written here. This one's 5 objectives and sort of diagonal deployments again. The twist is that you do the pre-game thing where you move some objectives by 6 inches. You both get to move an A1, then a B1. You nominate an objective in the opponent's half to be the primary objective, and then you get 3 victory points per turn if you manage to hold the priority objective in your own half. I think this is usually just going to give you a strong point in no man's land that you basically have to try and hold against all comers. Overall, I must admit I do really quite like the look of these new missions. I don't think they're massively going to change things enormously compared with the old ones, but at least they're all a little bit different. It actually does matter which mission you're playing, they're not all basically the same. I guess my only slight fatigue is that it will mean basically keeping track of 4 different secondaries rather than 3, and counting up the score might be a little bit more faff, as of course the primary still caps at 45, including both parts of the primary. It's weird to have basically another secondary in play that kind of isn't a secondary. Maybe a slight hit on the complexity front, but overall I think it makes for a more interesting game and forces some armies to play a bit differently. I guess the only slight apprehensions are that certain armies just really aren't going to get on too well with certain missions. Things like knights aren't really going to like the action ones very much, though they'll super enjoy the kill point one. I think it always leaves a bit of a bad feeling if the game's basically decided by which mission that you wind up playing. I guess that's the trade-off between having all the missions basically be the same all the time. Next up, in a change that we've known for quite a while, 7 of the secondary objectives have been altered. Games Workshop previewed them in a previous tournament that they ran. Most of them are broadly the same, and even the altered ones have only really had tweaks. Engage on All Fronts now needs either a vehicle or a unit with 3 or more models in it to be in each quarter to actually score it. It means that tiny units and characters aren't going to be able to achieve that secondary, so it's a bit of a nerf on a very good one. Bring It Down has got a fair bit easier. Now vehicles will give up 2 victory points if they're 10 wounds, or 3 victory points if they're 16 wounds. It'll be a bit of a nerf to the vehicles that fall into those exact brackets, particularly things like 10 wound transports. No prisoners, I think they felt, was just a little bit underpowered. You now get an extra victory point if you killed 50 wounds worth of enemy models, or an extra 2 instead if you kill 100 wounds. Not the biggest deal, but makes the objective a bit more appealing. Deploy teleport homers perhaps wasn't taken very much. Now if you manage to do the action with troops units, they can do the action ending at the end of your turn, rather than waiting for the opponent to blow them up while they're trying to do it. Definitely a boost. I'm still not sure how much it's going to see play compared with things like banners. Retrieve Nachmund data is the new version of Retrieve Octarius data. On the one hand, bikes can do it too, but on the other hand, it now has a chance of failing. If you've got less than 6 models in the unit, or less than 5 if you're troops, you basically roll a dice, and if you roll above the number in the unit, then the action just doesn't pass. With this secondary, you really can't afford to be failing it on any turn whatsoever, so it means you're only really going to want to attempt it with the units that are going to guarantee its success. So units like 5 model troops or 6 model other squads are going to be the way to go for this. Investigate Signal is now a lot more usable. It's the one where you do the action on the centre board objective, but now you can at least start it even if there are opponents within 6 inches. Before we could just completely deny your opponent being able to do this, just by pinging a few expendable models onto the centre objective each turn, even if you have no intention of actually holding it. Finally, Psychic Interrogation now no longer needs line of sight, so it's harder to counter by putting characters behind line of sight blocking terrain. A whole load of small buffs and nerfs there. I think the Engage on All Fronts and Retrieve Nachmund data changes mean that we'll see a lot less small utility units, and Bring It Down is slightly bad news for really big armies of tanks or vehicles. Overall, I think that these are really good changes though, even if by trying to balance them better, you are going to make a bit more decision paralysis for certain armies. I was a bit disappointed not to see any changes to the Assassinate secondary. That would be quite a good one for its interactions with multi-model character units like Gaunt's Ghosts, which currently give up max points for it. As well as just rebalancing the core secondaries though, we have 6 new ones for 6 factions that don't have codexes yet. The only ones that don't have them are Tau, whose codex is due out very soon, and Eldar, which are rumoured to be coming in February or March. In any case, we do have 6 different objectives. The cards that you can see here came with the January White Dwarf, and we've got them for Demons, Chaos Marines, Guard, Tyranids, and both Chaos and Imperial Knights. The Demon one's maybe a bit weak, it's a morale related one, so very situational. 1 victory point for each enemy model that flees, and 1 victory point if you kill a unit and you roll 2d6 that's equal or greater than their morale. You can score up to 4 victory points per turn from it. To be honest, I think it is really quite an interesting fluffy one, but it's only ever really going to be in serious contention if you're going to be playing against a whole load of Horde type units with not very good leadership. Maybe something like Foot Guard perhaps, where you can inflict multiple casualties on multiple units and force some morale fails. For Chaos Marines, you have the Long War. This one's a no mercy, no respite one. You get 1 victory point per enemy unit on an objective that's killed, and 2 victory points for taking an objective from an opponent. It's really quite similar to one of those bonus primary missions, and I think again it might be quite good on really high objective count games, particularly again if your opponent has lots of units that are easy to kill. Kind of situational again though, I really don't think you're ever going to max this, but should reward you with a fair few victory points just from doing what your army wants to do anyway. Next up for the nightly ones, Imperial Knights is Yield No Ground, Battlefield Supremacy, and you score it at the end of your turn but not in the first turn. You get 2 victory points for controlling half or more of the objectives on the board, 2 victory points if no enemy units are within your deployment zone, and 1 victory point if no knights from your army move closer to your own board edge. Maxing out at 5 victory points per turn does seem like it could be quite possible to max this, but you are kind of gambling on your army surviving at least late into the game. No victory points on Battle Round 1 means that it only really kicks off in the later turns. Perhaps a good one to pick if you think that you can dominate the primary, maybe with a bunch of OBSEC armigers. For Chaos Knights we have Path of Destruction. This one's a no mercy no respite one, and this one's scored at the end of each battle round. This one's basically for Chaos Knights killing units. 1 victory point per Chaos Knight killing a unit that's entirely within your own deployment zone, 1 victory point if they're in the midfield, and 1 victory point in the enemy deployment zone. It's the last one that really makes this hard to do, I think. It means you're guaranteed not to be getting it turn 1, and even then I think you're really going to struggle to score above something like 8 victory points. Again though, it's one that's far easier if your opponent has absolutely tons of units on the table, so it partly depends on what you're fighting. Against multiple small units, it could be one that you can basically guarantee a fair few victory points for, even if you're definitely not going to max it. Seems worse than the Imperial one though, if I had to pick between the two. Guard I think have quite a nice simple one. For the Emperor is a simple purge the enemy one, and you basically kill enemy units up to 3 victory points per battle round. It's like the Chaos Knight one, except there's no awkward and annoying positioning restriction. Still though, again provided your opponent has a fair amount of units on the board, this one I don't think is such a bad pickup. Could easily be worth a good 10 plus victory points in the right situation. Again I think it's quite unlikely that you're going to max that out though. Killing 3 units in both the first and the last battle round both seem like they're quite unlikely to do. Finally for the Tyranids we have Synaptic Insight. This one's one where you keep a kill tally for your Synapse units, and you want to be going after big hefty models from the enemy army. Each model killed that's 3 to 5 wounds scores 1, 6 to 9 wounds scores 2, and 10 plus wounds scores 3. Dedicated transports don't count, and your aim is to get 3 victory points if you get a kill tally of 4 plus in each battle round. I personally don't really rate this one very well. You need to have really quite a lot of Synapse units on the board to even make it worth considering, and also need to be matched against the right opponent with a whole ton of the relevant targets. Even in the best case scenario, this seems kind of niche. Overall though, I think it's quite nice for Games Workshop to throw a bone to the armies that don't have codexes yet. This is just one way in which they're a little bit behind a bunch of the 9th edition books. In particular, I think these extra secondaries will be quite nice for the Guard and the Imperial Knights. I think they seem like some of the most interesting ones out of the selection. Finally, here are just a few thoughts on who I think benefits and loses out most from all these changes. Fortifications certainly received a small buff here. It's much less of a liability to bring one into a competitive game than it was. At least you'll know you'll be able to deploy them somewhere. Knights and Guard I think will be helped out by those usable secondaries. I think any army that's got lots of 5-man OBSEC troops will really enjoy the new secondaries as well. Units like Guard Scions, Drakari Racks, maybe even the cheap discounted Necron Flayed ones with OBSEC will all be pretty handy for doing secondary objectives. Secondly, I think maybe the book's kind of a stealth buff to any faction that really just had one cohesive army and didn't make use of the multi-sub-faction thing. A significant chunk of the most competitive armies out there did like to run multiple sub-factions in their top builds. so if your army was already not using those, it's kind of a buff just by having some weaker competition to face against. On the nerf side, as I said, I do think that that's the most important change out of any of these. Adeptus Sororitas are going to have to commit to Bloody Rose or one of the more shooty orders. Grey Knights can only have the one Grandmaster Dread Knight and can't mix things like Sword Bearers or Prescient Brethren. Guards can't just put all their tanks in one tank custom regiment and then have Cadians or Catachans or something for the rest. Orcs are kind of similar, dividing their shooting and melee units, and Drakari Covenants can't use both Dark Technomancers and the -1 damage one. It's certainly going to shake up some of the best armies for all of these factions. Otherwise, if you're spamming loads of tank and monster armies, if you have a lot of 10 wound or 16 wound models, then they're going to be a bit easier to score points against. Little utility units are kind of a bit worthless now. Things like 4 Servitors, 2 Crusaders or 1 Lictor just aren't going to be able to jump around the board doing nuisance actions and getting in table quarters like they could. 5-man troop squads with deployment options seem to be one of the best ways to go for that now. Finally, there's just a very small nerf to Space Marines who now can't double up on 2 of their own book secondaries. This probably hits the Dark Angels hardest, who really like Oaths of Moment plus one of their great ones from their book. Overall, I must admit I do like most of the changes. I feel like these sort of changes often are Games Workshop's way to try and bully people into making armies that look more like cohesive armies, and have that as the most competitive thing that you can play in-game. I'll be interested to hear what you think of the changes though. Are they good? Are they bad? How does it affect your force? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I will certainly keep these regular videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is down in the video description. It is what supports me to keep on making these videos, and it's quite a big motivation to keep on making them, even when my vocal cords are trying to give up on me. I do try and give a fair few benefits for patrons, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.